On the morning of December 6, 1955, Igor Bensen, aeronautical engineer and former research chief at General Electric's Jet Engine Division, taxied a machine of his own construction to the end of a grass strip outside Raleigh, North Carolina, advanced the throttle on a 72-horsepower McCulloch piston engine mounted behind his seat, and lifted into the air, sitting completely in the open, with nothing between him and the ground below, except the freewheeling rotor turning above his head. The machine had no fuselage, no enclosed cockpit, no instruments beyond a tachometer and an airspeed indicator mounted on a small bracket in front of his face. The frame was welded tubular steel. The rotor blades were aluminum. The entire aircraft weighed 247 pounds empty. Bensen had built it in his garage over the previous 18 months from materials he had purchased at a hardware store and a surplus aircraft parts supplier. What he had built was a Bensen B-8M Gyrocopter, a single-seat, open-frame, pusher-propeller autogyro that any person with basic mechanical skills, a set of plans available by mail order for $12, and approximately $800 in parts could assemble in their own workshop and fly from any open field. The Civil Aeronautics Authority had no certification category for what Bensen had just flown. The experimental amateur-built category did not yet exist in the form that would eventually govern thousands of home-built aircraft. What existed was a machine that flew, a pilot who had designed and built it. And a question that the aviation establishment had not yet been asked in quite this way before. Who was allowed to fly an aircraft nobody had certified? Before you can understand what Bensen built and why it flew when nothing like it had flown before in the hands of ordinary people, you need to understand what personal aviation looked like in the United States in 1955 and what it cost. A Piper Cub in 1955 sold for approximately $2,000 new. A Cessna 172 introduced that same year, listed at around $8,750. These were not expensive aircraft by the standards of industrial production. They were, however, beyond the financial reach of most Americans who wanted to fly but could not justify the cost of a certificated aircraft. The ongoing expense of hangar rental, annual inspections, and the regulatory requirements that came with owning and operating a type-certificated machine. Bensen had understood something that the certificated aircraft industry had not yet fully confronted. The demand for personal flight existed well below the price point that existing aircraft could reach. There were people, mechanics, engineers, farmers, veterans with wartime flying experience, who wanted to fly, understood machines, and could build something if someone gave them plans and specifications they could trust. The autogyro principle gave Bensen his safety argument. Unlike a fixed-wing aircraft, an autogyro cannot stall. Its rotor turns freely in the airflow, regardless of forward speed. If the engine stops, the rotor continues to auto-rotate, to turn driven by the airflow alone, providing a controlled descent to the ground. The landing speed of the B-8M was approximately 0 to 15 miles per hour. A pilot who lost his engine over a field did not face a forced landing problem. He faced a parking problem. This was not the whole story, but it was the story Bensen told. Before we continue, if this kind of aviation documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing to the channel. Every episode here follows a specific aircraft and a specific crew through a specific operation, with the instruments, the procedures, and the limitations of the era they were flying in. No aircraft worship, no simplified history, just the operational record, told as accurately as the sources allow. If that is what you want from aviation history, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And leave a comment. Yeah, did you build or fly a Bensen B-8M or any other home-built gyrocopter? Do you have logbook entries, build records, or personal accounts from the early home-built aviation movement? Do you have a family connection to Igor Bensen or the Bensen Aircraft Corporation? The people who were there carry information that no published record fully captures. We want to hear from them. Now, back to the aircraft. The Bensen B-8M was not difficult to fly in the sense that a Lockheed Constellation or a de Havilland Comet was difficult to fly. It had no systems to manage, no pressurization, no fuel cross-feed, no complex emergency procedures. A pilot who could control the stick and rudder pedals and manage a simple throttle had the physical skills the machine required. What the machine demanded was different from what any certificated aircraft demanded, and it demanded it in a way that no ground school had yet addressed. Let me tell you what sitting in a Bensen B-8M in flight actually required of the person in the open seat. Because without this, the accident record that accumulated through the late 1950s and 1960s cannot be understood. The B-8M had no cockpit. The pilot sat on an open seat with the airstream at 60 miles per hour hitting him directly. At altitude, the rotor wash added its own turbulence to the airflow. The pilot's inputs to the control stick governed the rotor disc tilt, not directly connected to ailerons or elevators in the conventional sense, but controlling pitch and roll through the disc angle. The relationship between stick input and aircraft response was not what any fixed-wing training had taught. Overcorrection produced oscillation. Overcorrection to the oscillation produced worse oscillation. A pilot who had learned to fly in a Cessna and then climbed into a B-8M without specific type training was not flying a simpler aircraft. He was flying a fundamentally different one. The CAA's accident records from the late 1950s document what happened when the gap between the machine's apparent simplicity and its actual handling requirements was not bridged by adequate training. Bensen knew this. His training recommendations were specific and conservative. Not everyone who bought his plans read the training section first. The Civil Aeronautics Authority, which became the Federal Aviation Agency in 1958 following the Grand Canyon collision and the Federal Aviation Act, did not know what to do with the Bensen B-8M when it first appeared. The regulatory framework for aircraft in the United States in 1955 assumed that aircraft were manufactured by companies, certified by the government, and operated by pilots holding appropriate licenses. The B-8M was none of those things. It was designed by one man, built from plans by private individuals in their garages, and flown from fields that had no certification as airfields by pilots whose qualifications the existing regulatory system had not specified. The regulatory response was not to prohibit the B-8M. It was, eventually, to create a category for it. The experimental amateur-built category, the regulatory framework that today governs more than 30,000 home-built aircraft flying in American airspace, was developed in significant part as a response to the reality that Bensen and his builders had created on the ground before the regulation existed. The FAA established standards for construction quality, airworthiness inspection, and pilot qualification that acknowledged both the right of individuals to build and fly their own aircraft and the obligation of the regulatory system to establish minimum standards for doing so safely. This was not a quick process. Through the late 1950s, B-8M builders operated in a gray area of regulation that the FAA was simultaneously trying to close and accommodate. Bensen cooperated with the regulatory process. He submitted his aircraft for testing. He published accident data. He revised his training recommendations in response to what the accident record showed. The competing force in the Bensen story was not a mechanical failure or a weather system. It was the gap between what an individual could build and fly and what the regulatory system was prepared to supervise. By 1965, more than 3,000 sets of Bensen B-8M plans had been sold. The number of completed aircraft flying at any given time was smaller. Not every set of plans became an aircraft, and not every aircraft built remained airworthy. But the home-built gyrocopter community that Bensen had created was large enough to have formed its own organization, the Popular Rotorcraft Association, and to have established a pattern of annual fly-ins that brought builders and pilots together to compare construction notes and share operational experience. A modern home-built aircraft builder reading the Bensen B-8M's history will recognize immediately what Igor Bensen established that the aviation establishment had not previously demonstrated: that a person of ordinary means and moderate mechanical skill could design, build, certify, and safely operate a flying machine. If the design was honest about what it required, the builder followed the plans faithfully, and the pilot trained specifically for the type before attempting to fly it. The experimental amateur-built category that exists in American aviation today, governing more than 30,000 registered home-built aircraft, is the institutional legacy of what Bensen proved was possible between 1955 and 1965. The Experimental Aircraft Association, founded in 1953, found in the B-8M and its builders a constituency that shaped the organization's growth and political influence through the following decades. The B-8M also established what home-built aviation could not escape: that a machine available to anyone created risks that a certificated industry could manage through type testing and manufacturing quality control, but that the home-built world had to manage through education, community standards, and the individual builder's willingness to understand what he had built before he flew it. That tension between accessibility and safety, between the freedom to build and the discipline to fly, is still the defining characteristic of the home-built aviation world that Bensen created. Igor Bensen died in March 2000 at the age of 82. He had lived to see the experimental amateur-built category that his aircraft helped create govern tens of thousands of home-built aircraft across the United States. He had lived to see the Popular Rotorcraft Association, which his B-8M builders had founded, become a permanent fixture of American sport aviation. He had lived to see the question he had asked on a grass strip outside Raleigh in December 1955: who is allowed to fly an aircraft nobody has certified, answered, imperfectly but durably, by a regulatory framework that acknowledged both the right and the responsibility. Several Bensen B-8M Gyrocopters survive in flying condition in private hands. A small number are in museum collections. The type is still being built from original plans by builders who have discovered the design decades after Bensen first flew it. The open tubular frame, the freewheeling rotor, the pusher propeller, the McCulloch engine, the same configuration that Bensen flew in 1955, is still being assembled in garages across the United States and in countries where the design's plans have found their way. The grass strip outside Raleigh, where Bensen made his first flight, is gone, absorbed into the suburban expansion of a city that has grown enormously since 1955. The sky above it is unchanged. What Bensen demonstrated in that first flight was not that personal aviation could be cheap, though the B-8M was cheap. It was not that home-built aircraft could be safe, though many B-8M pilots flew for years without incident. What he demonstrated was that the boundary between the people who flew and the people who built had been drawn in the wrong place, and that moving it carefully with attention to what the machine actually required of the person who flew it was both possible and worth doing. If this is the kind of aviation history you want to keep watching, subscribe to the channel. More aircraft, more crews, more operations, more of what the record actually shows. And if you have a connection to what you just watched, a logbook entry from the home-built era, a Bensen B-8M you built or flew, a family member connected to Igor Bensen or the popular Rotorcraft Association, a document or photograph that fills in a gap in the record, tell us in the comments. Which aircraft? Which years? What the operational reality was from the inside. The pilots who flew these aircraft kept aviation moving forward through the most technically demanding period in the industry's history. Their operational knowledge deserves a record. We want to contribute to that record.